from the Board of Economic Advisors of a reduction in the projected revenue of $140 million, and the board's, whatever the board chooses to do, first considering the reduction of the capital reserve fund.
Governor, based on the numbers that I've seen, I would move that we sequester the capital reserve fund. I think it's going to be needed for closing the year-end books. I don't think there's any question about that.
I'd second that.
Okay. Any other discussion? Motion's been made and seconded.
Well, I will discuss. I really think that we need to go beyond that, based on results that we've seen in July. July's results have shown absolutely no turnaround for a trend that began in the last half of the year. And in fact, while the capital reserve fund would consume about 2% of a revenue shortfall, what we're experiencing currently is a 3% revenue shortfall. And I think that the sooner we deal with the additional shortfall, the more fair we are to agencies, the more opportunity we have for agencies to be able to respond to any set-aside that we mandate. And so I agree that the capital reserve fund ought to be set aside to cover projected shortfall. But the BEA is projecting a larger shortfall than we have available in the capital reserve fund. And actual revenue collections indicate that we will be at least 1% beyond what the capital reserve fund would provide us to cover a shortfall. So I think that the longer we wait to deal with those projected shortfalls, the harder it's going to be for most agencies to deal with. I think now would be probably the time to require that agencies set aside a little bit money, not take it away from them, but at least set those funds aside. And if we see a recovery, and we all hope we do, then the money goes back to the agencies.
Governor?
Yes, sir.
General, I agree with you. Looking at the numbers we're looking at, I think we need to set aside or sequester not only the capital reserve fund, we need to do a larger amount of instructing the agencies to reduce expenditures. If you recall, the appropriation bill this year, one of the provisos said that if we had shortfalls and closed the books, which we obviously have, that the board decide how much to direct agencies to reduce expenditures.
If we had to, but we'll have reserves sufficient in closing the books for the year just finished.
That's right.
To avoid having to go back to agencies
Yeah.
to tell them prospectively to reduce their expenditures.
I certainly would advocate that. I would think more like 2-3% in addition to the capital reserve fund. That's the numbers I'm looking at. It looks like the economy is, I don't see it turning.
Yes, sir.
I'm also concerned too, and I think your point's well made when you say that. And I'd be inclined to going ahead and reduce it a reduction of 3%.
So your motion by May would be directing the agencies to reduce expenditure by 3%.
Right. I've got a proven across-the-board reduction in expenditures of general fund appropriations of all state agencies, except where prohibited by proviso of 3% pursuant to proviso 80A.11 of the fiscal year 2008-2009 Appropriation Act, with these funds to be returned to state agencies should revenue collections increase in the future.
I
And
would
what
second.
data do we have available to support? I'm not arguing against that, I understand. It's not very often that you go further to the right on these issues than I do. I'm just wondering what data you've looked at that I haven't.
General, I'm just looking at the overall economy in the country. I just, over the weekend, saw some, what I consider very credible forecast. Probably the economy's going to grow 0.5% to 1%, which is pretty tough because VEA, I guess, probably based theirs on about 3.5%, 3.8% growth. Now, obviously, that number would have been nationwide. I don't know exactly how that correlates in South Carolina, but I just, my thought is in the same thought you had, if we're going to make a cut, it needs to be done early rather than later. If we wait till mid-year, instead of a 1% or 3%, it becomes a 2% or 6%.
Sure.
So, and I sat through this in the September 2002 board meeting.
I remember that.
$337 million. We had to suck it up and do that. But I think we did the right thing. Actually, we did that over the objection of Governor Hodges, if you recall. He had his chairman of BEA. I accused him in this room of looking through his rose-colored glasses because he was telling the board that the next 10 months of that fiscal year, revenues would grow 12.2%. Obviously, we know what happened there. But I would second the motion that the treasurer just made.
Maybe a couple other things. Just some of the things that's got me worried too. I was meeting with the State Department of Education the other day, and one of their concerns is fuel costs for the buses is going up. So there's going to be some hits there that we kind of tough to measure at this point. And of course we've got the corrections deficit coming forward, and I just think it'd be a prudent thing to do to go on ahead and set it a little higher than what we might be thinking. Hoping it comes in a little lower.
And we're not talking about agency cuts at this point. We're talking about the set-aside or the sequestration of those funds.
No, I would suggest that we're talking about sequestering the capital reserve fund. And to comply with the proviso in this year's appropriation bill, which basically says that this board will direct agencies to reduce spending by whatever amount we decide upon. If we decide upon 1%, they'd reduce by 1%. If we decide upon 3%, they'd reduce by 3%, based on that proviso.
So that'd be a permanent reduction.
Well, I guess my question would be this. The sine die that Joel signed said that basically if you got to 4% reduction, then the legislative body wasn't required, but would contemplate coming back in to deal with the budget cuts. We're really looking at a 5% cut, because if you're talking at 2% in capital reserve, which basically amounts to 2% of the budget, and then you look at 3% across the board with agencies, you're looking at a 5% cut. So you're a point past the 4% possibility of the legislative body reconvening to deal with budget issues.
Except that the resolution didn't say cuts of that amount. It said if revenues fell short.
That's right.
By
Right.
4% or more.
That's right.
And the revenues aren't there yet.
But what everybody's basically saying is
The senator's saying he expects it to
he
get
expects
there.
it to get there. So what I would just say would be, again, this has been long-standing from an administration standpoint. I mean, there are about $8 million in the competitive grants program. There's about $8 million shortfall within corrections. I mean, if rather than just simply treating all agencies as equal, some of which have been great stewards of the taxpayer dollar, others of which have not, or arguably have not, wouldn't it make more sense for the legislative body to come back in and to point at those agencies that maybe haven't done as good a job and to, in other words, not penalize the folks that have really been great stewards of
Target the cuts.
targeted cuts as opposed to across the board. It seems to me that that would be a more constructive way of handling the downturn rather than simply across the board that treats everybody equally.
That's why I think having agencies set the funds aside now gives you all flexibility of freeing that money up and then coming back and making targeted cuts if revenues fall an additional 1% by the end of this quarter. And the resolution that was passed directs the General Assembly to look at revenue collections at the end of the first quarter and at the end of the second quarter. And if at the end of either of those quarters there's a 4% shortfall, then the body can come back and target cuts.
Either way, you wouldn't do anything until after the BEA meets anyway. Yep.
I'm just, the point I'm trying to get to is to get it as early as we can so there's not a real strain on the agencies. If we're not firm, I don't know if that's prudent enough if we're not firm, will they all react to it if we just say it might happen? And they might think it.
Yeah, but if we set
Once
the
you've
fund-
sequestered it, you can't.
It's out of their hands. I mean, the money's taken from budget office, records the reduction.
By sequestering, and then if we free the money up at the end, does somebody not have the possibility then to just go out and buy from a whim?
At a
Like
whim.
first time money type thing, they just go spend it anyway?
No, but if it's sequestered, then it gives the legislative body, since the legislative body legitimately controls the purse strings of state government, the ability to come back in and say, we're going to take here, we're going to reward here, we're going to take here, we're going to add here. It gives them discretion that they wouldn't have if it was across the board cut presently.
That's the question I had. Does the legislative body have a chance at a second bite if it's sequestered, or is it automatically goes back to the agency and they have the opportunity to do what they want to with it before it can get touched?
I think that we have the authority to control.
We would have it, or the?
I mean, we
General
would
Assembly?
have to release those set-aside funds. We'd effectively release them to the General Assembly to use as they'd see fit in their targeted cuts. I mean, at that point, I think the timing would be such that we'd release those funds simultaneous with the General Assembly's reallocation of funds through targeting and shifting.
Is that how, I just want to make sure how it goes at the end. That's one thing that worries me, if we don't have a good exit strategy at the end of that point. And if it just goes back to the agency and they have the opportunity to just, we need a whatever, and let's just go buy it before it goes over to the General Assembly. That's what I understood sequestering did. It kept it out of the loop until we realized we didn't have the funds. We do have the funds, that we could release it. Once released, it goes back to the agency. But I might be mistaken there. It may not. I don't know.
General, I'd need to go back and look at the statute. This board has the authority to sequester funds. I'm not sure we have the authority to release those sequestered funds.
Well, either this board or the General Assembly would have that authority.
Okay.
Someone would,
General Assembly certainly has the authority.
you're the lawmaker, Senator. You could do whatever you wanted to.
Well, not always.
You always do.
Captain, we have a motion and a second. I call for the question on that motion.
Questions have been called. Before we do, I want to make this point, just because my love of charts, never-ending love of charts. And this is important as we think about this, Al, because it goes back to the larger issue of moral hazard if we simply go down the road of cutting across the board a bunch of different agencies rather than sequestering the funds. Sequestering the funds leaves in place the opportunity for the General Assembly to come back in and deal with these numbers. The numbers are in part caused by the very things that both of you are alluding to in terms of energy prices skyrocketing, the credit market that has been rocked to its core, and its implications for people being able to buy or sell a home. But part of the problem here is a result of a ramp up in state spending that has put us at the far end of the bell curve. And South Carolina has seen 30.8% growth in state spending over the last 2 years, which puts us above every other state in the Southeast, puts us above the Southeastern average. Only one state has exceeded us, and that's been Tennessee. And so I think it's important when we look at the hole that we're in and examining how we got here to recognize not only some of this has been inflicted by the national numbers that have come our way, some of it's indeed been self-inflicted, which makes it, I think, that much more important that we be targeted in cuts as opposed to across the board. These are numbers in terms of top 10 states in the country with regard to spending. South Carolina ranks 5th in the nation with regard to its increase in spending. This is a chart again. Some of the guys in the office got a little bit overborne there, but the point is, our executive branch budget tried to hold us at population plus inflation. We would not be dealing with these problems. This goes back to a 5-year, 6-year almost spending war that we've had at times. But if we had held to population plus inflation, we could be avoiding many of these self-inflicted injuries right now. We've had conversations with the DEA about slowing the numbers. This is, again, going back to the numbers you point to. If you look back to the early 2000s, this thing can be, really, really rough. This is what we saw with the Pekin Valley approach to spending a number of years ago when this administration first came in, going back to the conversations you'd had with Hodges BA person. It is important that we not duplicate this, and part of not duplicating this, it seems to me, is not just having appropriation of funds at the General Assembly level, but when the tough times come, you want to actually hand those cuts out at the General Assembly as opposed to some third body handing the cuts off, which I think insulates people from avoiding these kinds of things. Yes, sir.
On that chart there, over a 3-year period, there was cuts of almost $1.34 billion.
Correct.
And I think I'm going by memory, but if I remember correctly, several states around us, of what you showed us early in those earlier charts, actually raised taxes during that period of time when we did not raise taxes. So I'm not too sure if the charts are that they have good meaning to them. Don't get me wrong. I understand what you're trying to get to, but
No, this just only dealt with spending. In other words, it didn't deal with tax revenue. In other words, we are at the far end of the curve with regard to spending.
No,
period.
what it was is they didn't have to reduce their spending because they had increased the revenues, and if you just go by percentage of increases there, then your percentages are going on a higher number.
No, I think the logic would be the reverse. They wouldn't have had, what you're saying is, if you raise your tax, you wouldn't have to decrease your spending as much. In fact, their spending was decreased more in terms of.
I'd have to go back and look at that because my memory of that is a little bit different than the way you're explaining it. But my big point that I'm trying to make is there were tax increases in other states where we were not increasing taxes, and we did decrease spending by about $1.4 billion. And we've only increased it since that period of time by about $600 million.
Well, the 1.4 billion is not a reduction in spending. That's the shortfall between estimates.
Well, there was a shortfall with estimates, but they reduced the spending so that there was no spending in there.
You can hardly argue that there was a reduction in spending given the significant increase in spending.
There's no money
Nor
there.
can you argue that the other states were able to avoid spending increases because they had more money to spend. That doesn't make sense.
I mean, a state like Florida, for instance, on a per capita basis, taxes less than we do. They also spend less than we do. So, in other words, it's a case of we are relatively expensive as a state, as a place to do business with, which goes back to the larger global competitiveness question. When we're 130% the U.S. average in the cost of our state government relative to other states like a Florida, which is closer to the 100% number than the 130% number. I mean, we're just, my only point here is it raises, once again, the importance of restraint in spending as a way of avoiding the very problem that we're in.
And with that chart you had, that's the point I'm trying to make. It forced us to reduce spending back during that period of time.
That's right.
It forced that $1.5 billion worth of reduction in revenue forced the state of South Carolina. And I know we went through spending cuts majorly during that period of time. And yes, you're right with the increase coming back, but we have not increased back where we were at the point 5-6 years ago.
That's absolutely incorrect. And I'm glad to see you the charge on that. We're way beyond where we were 5 or 6 years ago.
Governor, I assume your spending chart there includes the over $500 billion that we've given in tax reductions over the past 3 years.
No, it does not. We've
Oh,
taken that out.
Took that out.
And this is the last thing. In order to, we took one last bite of the apple, closed this legislative session with regard to vetoes offered, and did not bite at the apple. Again, we can't do anything about past history, but the point is,
That shows 0.5% of what you had attempted to
right.
to trim, got trimmed.
This train has been coming for a long time. We've had consternation, a bit of fussing at times, a bit of carrying on at times about whether or not it was or wasn't coming. It's here. Now the question is, how are we going to deal with it? And I think it's incredibly important to do as the Comptroller General is suggesting, which is, by all means, set aside as much as you want to say. You could make the number 5%, you could make the number 10%, you could make the number whatever you want to make it within the range of prudent. But I think it's then important for the General Assembly to come back and make targeted cuts as opposed to treating all agencies equally, because the fact is, not every one of them is in the same financial position. I mean, for instance, if you look at colleges, in some cases they go out and raise tuitions on students, which we've had an objection with given the rate of increase of student tuitions. That is not an option in corrections. They can't go in charge or inmate. And so there are just a lot of differences between the different agencies. And the idea of lumping them all in together and treating them equally, I think is at odds with their very real needs. And the degree to which some have been great stewards of taxpayer dollars and the degree to which others have not.
And Governor, I'd make the point that that the Treasurer made a very good point. Education is struggling with the rising cost of fuel for its school bus fleet. If we mandate across-the-board cuts, that includes education as well. There are buses that aren't going to be able to leave the parking lot. And there are probably teachers that aren't going to be able to be hired this year if we require a 3% cut from education.
Governor, let me point out to us, if we do what the Treasurer's motion proposes to do, General Assembly can come back in January and by joint resolution revisit those cuts. So General Assembly will have an opportunity to look at this.
Your signing resolution says you can come back tomorrow.
It says we can't, doesn't say we will.
No, but you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is reviewed for January.
Governor, I call for the question. There's a motion before the body.
And what I'm a little confused. What is exactly the motion?
I'm a little confused too. Let me be sure I have this. So first, the first part of the motion is to reduce the capital reserve fund.
Sequester.
Sequester.
Well, you really,
Reduce it, okay.
you're really just reducing that, I think. And now, the second part of the motion is to impose a 3% budget reduction. Is that correct? That's correct.
But legally, can we sequester the capital reserve fund and mandate a cut on agency spending? Constitutionally,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It has to be reduced. That's
It
why
can't
I'm
be
using the
sequestered.
word.
Well, I don't know what sequester is.
Well, I'm suggesting,
It has to be cut permanently before an agency cut can be made.
I'm suggesting on the capital reserve fund, you
Yeah.
use the term reduce the
Right.
capital reserve
Rather
fund.
than set aside.
Because that's basically what the law says.
I mean, we'd have to. The law in the Constitution
And
says that.
and then on the 3%, that would be a reduction,
In expenditures.
in expenditures. Okay. All right, so that would be one motion right there. And actually, if someone would like to perfect that motion and second it again.
Well,
that would be-
describe cut. In other words, this is a cut rather than a sequester of the 3%?
Yes, sir. That's what I'm hearing.
Across the board.
Reduction.
And what would an across the board cut produce? It would produce much more than $63 million per.
Well, it's
because it
62.6.
includes all agencies.
Well, under the law, you can only reduce the certain things are exempted. But
Right.
and it would be $62.6 million, or 62.7 per percent. Isn't that correct, Les?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's not really the full 70.
Okay.
There's some exemptions. So that is the motion as I understand
Right,
it.
I just said at the end of my motion about, and I think you just said it though, except where prohibited by proviso, and then I said that of the 3% pursuant to proviso 88.11.
Yes.
And that takes care of what I think you just said.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is it, what's 88?
It basically would exempt, I mean, there's some things that are, that we
Debt
can't do.
service.
Yes.
Capital reserve fund,
Right.
life scholarships.
So you have before you a motion to reduce capital reserve fund and to impose expenditure reductions on agencies of 3%.
That's correct.
Now, here's something we really ought to be thinking through. We know that corrections is going to be operating in a deficit. We know that. And I'd commend corrections because they came in this year at a reduced point, lower than what we were projecting their deficit to be. But we know that they're going to be incurring a deficit this coming year. A 3% reduction in corrections would produce, it would increase their deficit from, 8 million, which is what the projection is, up to another, 10 beyond that. So,
And education is currently configured to run a deficit.
yeah, I'll try to find out on the schedule
I
here.
thought it was.
They have,
Based on the school budget.
They have contacted our office and are currently working, we're working with them preliminarily on their situation with their, particularly the bus view
Right.
situation.
I mean, again, I could not agree more with the premise that y'all are laying out, which is you need to deal with the budget and shortfalls sooner rather than later. I absolutely agree. My only question, though, is tied to the how. I don't think that there is any equality in the competitive grants program. Just to use an example, it was highlighted in a couple of coastal papers over the weekend with a $100,000 grant for German politicians to come and visit Myrtle Beach. And even the Sun News wrote about how bogus they thought that this particular proposal was. That program gets a 3% cut the same way that corrections, which goes to housing some of the most dangerous people that have been, jailed and sentenced in our state, gets a 3%. Or for that matter, some of the investments that we make in human capital and from an educational standpoint versus some other things. I mean,
$73 million from education. This motion would take $73 million from education.
so I think it is important to do what we're talking about. But again, I think it ought to be done in a targeted fashion, because if not, you create this moral hazard, which is when times are rolling, which is what we've had this fight about over the last 5 years. There's this endless propensity to spend more, and our case is well above the southeastern average. But when times don't go so well, no legislator feels the heat. It comes back to the five of us, and somebody else makes those cuts. That is a formula for getting ahead of yourself with regard to spending, which we've certainly done over the last couple of years. And I think it's important to go back in a targeted fashion and say, all right, let's make some adjustments here, but let's make them based on the merits of who's adding more to increasing per capita income or one's lifestyle in South Carolina or one's chance of life in South Carolina than just across the board.
General, what was the cut to education back in 02, 03?
I don't know. You were there.
It'd be a lot more than what you're talking about there.
But there was a need back then because
There's a
there
need.
was an actual shortfall that had been developed. Right now, you're saying that not based on what we're experiencing, but based on things you heard over the weekend about some credible economist theory, there are going to be additional shortfalls that we haven't seen develop in the state yet. And so I feel a little bit differently about this proposal to go that far, the 3%. I am comfortable with making a permanent, if we had to, permanent across-the-board 1% cut. Much more comfortable with that because I can see, based on our July numbers and based on the months leading up to July, I can see that that's a very reasonable course for this board to take because those are the sorts of revenue shortfalls that are actually developing. It doesn't have any cushion built into it, but we could come back a month from now if we had to, if we see additional shortfalls develop.
But General, here again, we come back next month, the month after, the month after.
They have less
Wait-
time.
wait
I
six-
understand.
You know, and it
I
makes it
understand.
tough on the agencies.
But what if a 3% shortfall doesn't develop? Then the agencies,
Well, then we back where the governor's trying to get us, is reduce spending.
well,
But in a targeted fashion, I guess that'd be my whole point, which is, I'm abashed about that.
At that point, wouldn't the legislation be able to come back and
Without question,
reshift if there's a
come
problem?
January,
And then
General
we're
Assembly
not
can-
that far out of the whole year.
That's right.
So then why
Johnson,
wouldn't you just sequester for the 3% rather than,
it's one and the same, I think, Governor. I don't know that the
once,
statute allows us to sequester on a future. I think, in particular with this proviso and this year's appropriation bill that says if the shortfalls occur, the board will direct the agencies to reduce spending. And of course, that's what you're telling us all the time, reduce spending. We're just trying
but
to
in a
comply.
targeted fashion.
Trying to comply
Not
with
all
some-
government is created equally.
Well, then the General Assembly could look at that in January.
But it wouldn't take place till the following year, based on the budget that y'all
It could take place mid-year, absolutely.
That's what my understanding would take place at that moment.
Sure.
Mid-year. So they'd have 5 months left if they took care of it in January.
I mean, the reality, though, of why you want to go to 3% is so you don't have to deal with that come January, and I don't blame you.
No. We don't shirk our responsibility.
Of course not. But I mean, it's something nobody wants to deal with, and so I think it would be not you personally, but as a body, something that the body wouldn't be just jumping and dealing with, and I wouldn't blame you.
Governor, again, I call for the question, the motion with a second.
Question's been called and seconded. Let me make one last case as we go to this vote. I think it's a real mistake to make across-the-board cuts because it presumes that every agency contributes equally to the bottom line of what's produced by state government. And I think that is absolutely not the case. Some are incredible stewards and others aren't. Some have outside revenue sources, others don't. And I think you really penalize a lot of hard-working folks that in many cases make a real difference for South Carolinians by going across the board cut. That being said, I'm sorry.
but there's a proviso that repeats itself from year to year that directs this board to take action once it knows, once it has information to know that there's going to be a shortfall. Your information, I don't think constitutes knowing. It's just kind of it's kind of a feeling. But in my mind, we know, based on July's results, which is the only month of this fiscal year, we know that there's going to be
Tough times.
a shortfall. We know what that shortfall is going to be based on this information, which is the only thing we know at this point. And I'm uncomfortable using just feelings based on nothing more than some national economist making some comment about the U.S. economy growing only 0.5% last year as a basis for
Governor,
mandating agency
Yes,
cuts.
sir.
I wish I had a tape of the September 17th, 2002 board meeting. That's exactly what was said time and time and time again by then Governor Hodges.
Except he was saying that we don't have enough information.
Well, that's what you just said. You
No,
don't have enough
I'm saying based on the information we have. He had information. But he argued that it wasn't enough. And you were arguing that, yes, it is. This is enough
Governor, I
information to
call
act
for the
on.
question. We've had a lot of discussion.
A question's been called. One last question, I guess, from a legal standpoint. Are we on legal ground here? I mean, what he's saying is the board has the authority in the event that a real revenue shortfall has been cast to go across the board, cut at 3%. There's been question raised on that from a legal standpoint. Where are we?
You want to discuss that in open session, Governor?
Yeah.
There needs to be there has to be a rational basis for whatever cutting occurs. Typically, the first starting point on that is the revenue projections coming from the BEA. This board, of course, knows the expenditure side knows the open-ended expenditures that are part of the equation better than anyone else. And the proviso certainly delegates to this board the authority to use its discretion to make a decision as to how much to cut the rate of expenditure to maintain the balance between the revenues and the expenditure. The further out you go on cutting the rate of expenditure, if it differs from the projections on revenue, the more likely we are to be challenged.
By who?
Any number of people. Our Supreme Court has kind of opened the door to anybody can sue anytime. In the past, we were sued by school districts.
So your opinion is what?
As long as we have a rational basis that the equation is rationally calculated, if this is the opinion of this board and we can support it with a factual predicate, that it is reasonable to cut the rate of expenditure by 3% in order to maintain a balanced budget, then it's defensible. I, of course, turn to this board for the consideration on that and whatever the factual predicate may be.
So what is the factual predicate?
I don't have the factual predicate other than what I've heard today.
Governor, my rationale, based on what Ed just says, first of all, we're looking at a tremendous shortfall this year that we're in. I think that's about $180 million. I believe that's the correct number. We're looking at open-ended accounts for life scholarships. We're looking, frankly,
180 for 0809, is that what you're talking about?
that's the number I'm hearing. No, 0708. 0708, the year that we're closing. And in addition to that, I'm hearing that probably the tax swap that we did for property tax and 1 cent sales tax is about $40-odd million short this year. That's something got the year we're in.
Well, we're in the new year. We're in
Well,
0809.
excuse me.
You're talking about
Okay,
0708.
0708, whatever you want to call that. And when I look at all those things, it just seems to me that the prudent thing to do is do the 3% and make absolutely sure that we have a balanced budget. So that's my rationale for it.
And we could accomplish that by setting aside funds, as opposed to legally mandating cuts.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't you do all those same things by sequestering
How do you
funds?
set aside funds? Do you direct the budget office to pull those funds out of the accounts?
That's how we've done it in the past.
Well, then you've taken the money from them.
But it could be restored if there's not the
Could be
need.
restored, General, but as Treasurer just pointed out, if the last 3 months of this year we're in, the economy turns and we restore it, that money can be spent for anything. And let me give you a personal example. Many, many years ago, about the 15th of June, one time I got a phone call and said, I need to buy some gravel. I said, what size? The person said, I don't know. So I worked for one of the state agents, I won't call the name. And I said, well, tell me what you're going to use it for. Maybe I can help you decide what size. Well, it doesn't matter. I've got this money. I'm just going to dump it out back. I want to make sure this money is used so we don't get a budget cut next year.
They were caught between a rock and a hard place, weren't they?
Only 2 rocks in hard places, that's right.
No, I know that.
So that would be, that's my rationale for supporting the treasurer's 3%.
Question's been called, it's been seconded. We've been dancing around the question and seconding for a little while here. I'll make one final comment. I don't think this will be the end. I think that gravity always works in life, and if you get way ahead of yourself with regard to spending, there's going to be the natural consequence to that. And we're going to see that unfold, I think, over the months and probably the year ahead. I would applaud the Senator's newfound financial reticence. It wasn't so many months ago that you were calling me Chicken Little as I talked about some of these numbers not materializing.
But we didn't know then the energy crisis.
Well,
Maybe
sneaky
you did.
suspicion that we couldn't get ahead of ourselves forever,
Maybe
but
you did,
anyway.
I didn't.
Maybe you didn't realize his energy level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, whatever. But anyway, so again, I concur with you on the degree to which the national slowdown is going to have implications not only for state government but for people's lives in South Carolina. I think it is an absolute mistake, however, to treat tourist holidays for German politicians as funded by state taxpayers through the competitive grants program equally with a school child in South Carolina. And that's, at the end of the day, what this proposal does. As the comptroller just pointed out, it's a $70 million cut in $73 million cut in education. I think that across-the-board cuts abandons the policy-making prerogative and
78, excuse me.
78, whatever, requirement of the legislative body to again be pointed, to be directed in dealing with these kinds of times. That having been said, the question's been called. It's been
Governor, I
seconded.
know you're aware that Sloan versus Budget Control Board, Supreme Court says any action taken by this board has to be across the board. It cannot be selective.
Right, but if we sequestered, it would then allow the General Assembly the time to come back in and indeed make across-the-board cuts, and that's what I think the Comptroller General and I are pushing for.
General Assembly still can come back in January and deal with the issue.
But again, based on your sine die, if you got to 4% shortfall in the budget, you could come back tomorrow. This could be dealt with by the General Assembly. I think it's a mistake not to be. That having been said, the question's been called, it's been seconded, we've danced around it. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed? Sounds like the noes get it.
We need one other.
We may want a show of a hand.
What's that?
You did that once before. We asked for a show of hands, remember?
All right, we'll do a show of hands. How's everybody recorded?
3 ayes and 2 noes is what I heard.
That's what you heard? Okay, we'll go with that then. All
However, we
right.
need just one perfecting motion to go along with that. The law requires when the reduction reaches the aid to subdivisions line item, before we take a separate vote on that. So you would need a separate vote to include the aid to subdivisions portion in the action that the board just took.
And what effect will that have on aid to local governments?
It's $2.9 million per percentage point.
So we're talking $9 million.
Roughly.
Doesn't the law also say that cannot be any less than last year?
Yes, sir.
So even if you do 3%, if it's would get to
It's a
below
floor.
that, then it
Unless
can't.
Will 3 hit a floor, do you know? Or is that?
No, there was a $19 million cushion for local government funds,
Okay.
so
All right.
equivalent at 6%. 3%
Okay.
is still within that range.
So this will take a little under 9 out of that 19 million. So you need a separate motion to comply with Code Section 62720.
So moved.
All right.
Been made, seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Opposed. Just one last editorial. I mean, this is just complete madness from the standpoint of fiscal discipline in the other sense. So in that, I just saw John Osmond around the corner, not to pick John out, but I mean, his agency is going to run a shortfall. It's already projected to run a shortfall. And to add a 3% cut to an agency that's already going to run a shortfall, all that means is you're stacking that much more debt to the taxpayers of South Carolina over the long run in dealing with this stuff. So we're just accruing to the next generation or somebody 5 years down the road paying for this. I think it's a real problem, but anyway.
Governor, may I have an
Yeah.
editorial comment?
Please.
You've had several
Yes,
this
sir.
morning.
Please.
Well, there's provision for Mr. Osmond or any other agency to come back to this board and ask to run a deficit. I've never known the board to deny that at the time that it's made a good case that there should be a deficit. So that provision's there.
But we're stacking deficits on top of deficits is my complaint. Go ahead, sir.
Green 3, the board